The conference room was packed with 12 of our biggest clients when she walked in. Not knocked, not asked permission, just walked right through that glass door like she owned the place, divorce papers in one hand and her phone recording in the other. I was mid-presentation, explaining quarterly projections to people who control million-dollar contracts, when my wife decided to make our private business everyone else's entertainment. The room went dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming. She held up those papers like some kind of victory flag and announced loud enough for the entire floor to hear that she was divorcing me. Right there, in front of everyone who matters to my career. But here's what really got me. She didn't just serve papers. She launched into this whole speech about how I'm an emotionally absent husband who cares more about work than his marriage. How I never listened to her needs. How I've been neglecting her for years while I chase success that never comes. Every word was calculated. Every accusation designed to make me look like a failure both personally and professionally. She even threw in some details about our bedroom life that had no business being aired in front of my colleagues. The clients shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. My boss stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation, but she wasn't done. She told everyone how I promised her a better life, delivered nothing but disappointment. How I'm stuck in a dead-end position while other men her age are actually providing for their families. That's when something clicked. This wasn't spontaneous emotional outburst. This was theater. Pure performance designed to destroy me where it would hurt most. She knew exactly what she was doing, standing there with that phone recording every second, probably planning to post it online later. She wanted me to break down, to beg, to apologize in front of everyone and validate her narrative that I'm some kind of inadequate husband who deserves public humiliation. Instead, I set my presentation remote down calmly and looked directly at her. Not at the phone, not at the papers, at her. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Everyone waiting to see how I'd react to being ambushed like this. Waiting to see if I'd crumble under the pressure of public embarrassment. But I've learned something about people like her over the years. They expect you to fight back immediately when they attack. They expect anger, desperation, or immediate surrender. What they don't expect is complete calm. I walked over to her slowly, close enough that only she could hear what I was about to say, and spoke just loud enough for my voice to carry without shouting. The words I chose weren't complicated. They weren't dramatic. But they cut through her performance like a blade through paper, and I watched her confident expression start to crack as she realized this wasn't going according to her script. What I said next changed everything. Not just for that moment, but for everything that came after. Because she thought she was playing a game where only she knew the rules. She thought wrong. What I told her was simple but devastating. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "If you wanted attention this badly, you should have just asked for it at home instead of embarrassing yourself in front of people who actually matter." Then I turned to the room and apologized for the interruption, suggesting we reschedule so everyone could focus on business instead of personal drama. Professional, controlled, like she was just another minor inconvenience to be handled. The clients respected that. They saw a man who wouldn't let personal chaos derail professional responsibilities. But she saw something else entirely. She saw that her big moment had backfired spectacularly. After everyone left, she tried to salvage the situation by getting emotional, but I was already walking away. I had work to finish, and frankly, I had bigger concerns than her theatrical performance. That evening, my phone started buzzing with texts from mutual friends. That's when things got interesting. 3 different people reached out to warn me about conversations they'd had with her over the past few months. Conversations I knew nothing about. Conversations where she'd been painting me as an increasingly problematic husband. She'd told our neighbor that I was becoming verbally abusive. She'd told her sister that I was having money problems and taking my stress out on her. She'd told her book club that I'd been staying out late and acting suspicious. None of it was true, but she'd been building this narrative systematically, person by person, creating a support network of people who already believed I was the problem before today even happened. The timing wasn't coincidental either. She'd been laying groundwork for months, making sure that when she finally made her move, everyone would already be on her side. The office ambush was just the finale of a much longer campaign. But here's what she didn't count on. Those same friends who were warning me also started sharing details about her behavior that I'd been too close to see clearly. How she'd been fishing for compliments about how she deserved better from other men. how she'd been posting cryptic social media messages about being underappreciated and ready for change, how she'd been testing the waters to see who would support her when she finally pulled the trigger. The picture that emerged wasn't of a woman driven to desperation by a neglectful husband. It was of someone who'd been strategically planning to destroy my reputation while positioning herself as the victim. She'd even been documenting things, taking pictures of me working late, recording conversations without my knowledge, screenshotting text messages where I'd been short with her due to work stress, building a case like she was preparing for court. But the most revealing detail came from her own sister, who called me directly that night. She was apologetic, almost embarrassed. She told me that my wife had been asking hypothetical questions about divorce proceedings for months. Not emotional, desperate questions. Tactical ones. Questions about how to maximize impact. How to ensure people would take her side. How to make sure I couldn't recover from the damage. Her sister had assumed it was just venting frustration, but now she realized it was strategic planning. She'd been treating our marriage like a business arrangement she was planning to terminate, and today's performance was her calculated exit strategy. The woman I'd been living with for years had been studying me like a target, not loving me like a husband. Every argument, every moment of tension, every time I'd prioritized work during a busy period had been filed away as ammunition for this moment. She thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. What she didn't realize was that I'd been watching her moves too. And now I understood the game she'd been playing all along. The next morning, I started digging. Not emotionally, but methodically. If she'd been building a case against me, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I started with her social media activity. What I found was a masterclass in victim narrative construction. For the past 6 months, she'd been posting subtle hints about being unappreciated and taken for granted. Nothing direct enough to seem like she was bashing me, but clear enough that her followers would read between the lines. The comments were revealing. Dozens of people telling her she deserved better and should know her worth. She'd been cultivating an audience of supporters who were already convinced I was the problem before they even met me. But the real evidence was in her search history. I'd always had access to our shared computer, something she'd apparently forgotten while she was busy planning my downfall. Google searches for how to document emotional abuse and what evidence do I need for divorce court dating back 4 months. Articles about protecting yourself financially during divorce and how to gather evidence of neglect. She'd been studying divorce strategy like it was a graduate course. Screenshots of our text conversations where I'd been brief or focused on work. Photos of me working late that she'd captioned in her phone as never present. The most damaging discovery was a private social media group she'd joined called Women Supporting Women Through Divorce. She'd been posting detailed accounts of our private conversations, asking for advice on how to make him see consequences and ensure he can't deny the truth. Hundreds of messages where she portrayed every normal marital disagreement as evidence of my character flaws. Times when I'd been stressed about work deadlines became proof that I was emotionally unavailable. Evenings when I'd been tired after long days became evidence that I didn't care about her needs. But here's what really caught my attention. She'd been documenting everything, but so had the group members. They'd been encouraging her to gather evidence and make sure everyone knows what kind of man he really is. The office ambush hadn't been her idea. It had been suggested by other women in the group as a way to show him consequences publicly and make sure his professional reputation reflects his personal failures. She'd been following a playbook written by people who'd never met me, but had already decided I was guilty of whatever she accused me of. I screenshot everything. Every post, every piece of advice, every strategy session where they'd planned how to maximize damage to my reputation. What she thought was her secret support network had become my evidence file. But the discovery that changed everything was finding out she'd been in contact with a specific lawyer for 3 months. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in high-conflict divorces and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Their email exchanges showed she'd been asking about ways to ensure he can't recover professionally and make sure the community knows what kind of person he is. She hadn't just been planning to leave me. She'd been planning to destroy me. Complete reputation assassination was always the goal. Now I understood why she'd chosen the office, why she'd recorded everything, why she'd spent months building her victim narrative. This wasn't about ending our marriage. This was about ending me entirely. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd documented everything, and I'd found it all. With everything I discovered, I realized she'd given me the perfect roadmap for my response. She'd used social media, mutual friends, and public humiliation as weapons. Now I'd use the same tools, but with one crucial difference. I had facts. First, I organized everything chronologically. Screenshots of her posts building the victim narrative. Evidence of her coaching group strategizing my destruction. Her search history showing premeditated planning. The lawyer communications revealing her true intentions. But I needed more than just defensive evidence. I needed to understand her vulnerabilities the same way she'd studied mine. That's when I started paying attention to patterns I'd previously ignored. How she always positioned herself as the victim in every story she told. How she'd never taken responsibility for anything that went wrong in any relationship, job, or situation. I reached out to people from her past. Not maliciously, but strategically. Her college roommate revealed she'd pulled similar stunts with previous boyfriends when things didn't go her way. Her former coworker mentioned how she'd created drama at her last job when she didn't get a promotion she wanted. The pattern was clear. When life didn't match her expectations, she didn't adapt or improve. She found someone to blame and launched a campaign to destroy their credibility while positioning herself as the innocent party. I wasn't her first target. I was just her most recent one. Armed with this understanding, I developed my strategy. She'd chosen to make this public, so my response would be public too. But where her approach had been emotional manipulation, mine would be factual devastation. I created a comprehensive timeline showing her months of premeditation alongside the reality of our actual relationship. Bank records showing I'd been financially responsible. Work schedules proving I'd been dedicated but not neglectful. Text messages showing I'd been communicative and supportive even when she was secretly building her case against me. The contrast was stark. Her narrative versus documented reality. But the centerpiece of my response would be her own words from that divorce support group. Every strategy session where they'd plan my destruction. Every piece of advice about maximizing damage. Every celebration of my anticipated downfall. She'd handed me the evidence of her malicious intent in her own voice. I decided to use the same platforms she'd used. The same mutual friends she'd turned against me. The same public forum she'd chosen for my humiliation. But I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd expose the entire operation. The coaching group, the strategic planning, the calculated deception. Everything. The timing had to be perfect. I waited until she'd started her next phase, posting about her brave decision to leave an impossible situation and thanking everyone for their support during this difficult time. She was basking in the sympathy and attention, convinced she'd successfully destroyed me while emerging as the hero of her own story. That's when I struck, not with anger or emotion, but with surgical precision. I posted everything. The timeline, the evidence, the screenshots, the pattern of behavior. But I didn't just dump it randomly. I crafted it like the presentation professional I was, laying out the case methodically and letting the facts speak for themselves. The response was immediate and devastating. I titled my post simply, "When someone shows you who they really are, believe them." The first section showed side-by-side screenshots. Her public posts about being underappreciated next to her private messages in the divorce group asking how to make him pay for wasting my time. Her tearful office performance next to her strategic planning sessions about destroying his professional reputation. But the real devastation came from her own words in that support group. I posted direct quotes where she'd celebrated the idea of ruining him completely and asked for advice on making sure he never recovers from this. The contrast was brutal. The sympathetic victim persona she'd cultivated crumbled when people saw her actual words about wanting to destroy me for sport. Within an hour, the comments started pouring in. People who'd supported her began questioning everything she'd told them. Her sister publicly apologized for believing the lies. Mutual friends started sharing their own experiences of her manipulation. But the most damaging response came from her divorce coaching group itself. Apparently, my exposure had violated their privacy rules, and several members started distancing themselves from the aggressive tactics they'd encouraged. Some even came forward to apologize for their role in encouraging her destructive behavior. Her carefully constructed support network collapsed in real time. She tried to respond, of course, posted about privacy violations and desperate attempts to shift blame. but every word she wrote only reinforced what I'd already proven about her character. The office incident that had seemed so damaging to me now looked like exactly what it was: a calculated attack by someone with no regard for professional boundaries or basic decency. My colleagues, who'd witnessed her ambush firsthand, started reaching out to express support. My boss called personally to apologize for not intervening more firmly and to assure me that my position was secure. But the real vindication came from her own family. Her brother reached out privately to say he'd suspected something wasn't right about her version of events. Her mother called to apologize for the things she'd said about me based on lies she'd been fed. The woman who'd spent months convincing everyone I was the problem suddenly found herself completely isolated, with her own actions and words serving as evidence against her. She made one final attempt to regain control by threatening legal action for defamation. But as I pointed out publicly, defamation requires lies, and everything I'd posted was either her own words or documented facts. Her lawyer, the one who'd been coaching her on high-conflict strategies, apparently advised her to drop the threat when she realized I had evidence of their communications about deliberately trying to destroy my reputation. The tables had turned completely. She'd gone from victim to villain in her own story, using her own words as evidence. But I wasn't done. The final phase of my response was the most important part, because it wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing something she'd tried to destroy: my reputation and my boundaries. I ended my post with a simple statement that made it clear this wasn't just about exposing her lies. It was about establishing exactly what kind of person I was and what I would and wouldn't tolerate going forward. My final statement was simple but definitive. I don't negotiate with people who try to destroy me. I don't forgive people who attack my livelihood. And I don't give second chances to people who show me their true character this clearly. This marriage is over, but on my terms, not hers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People who'd watched her performance now understood they'd witnessed a calculated attack, not a desperate woman's cry for help. The sympathy she'd cultivated evaporated completely. Her divorce coaching group kicked her out for bringing negative attention to their community. Several members publicly distanced themselves from the toxic advice they'd been giving. The group itself eventually shut down after other members started questioning the ethics of their strategic destruction campaigns. But the most satisfying consequence was watching her scramble to control damage that was entirely of her own making. She deleted her social media accounts, but screenshots of her posts were already circulating. She tried to reach out to mutual friends, but they'd all seen the evidence of her deception. Her professional reputation suffered too. Word spread about her office ambush, and her own workplace started questioning her judgment and stability. The woman who tried to destroy my career had damaged her own instead. The divorce proceedings became a completely different conversation. Her lawyer, faced with evidence of her client's malicious intent and strategic planning, advised settling quietly rather than risking further exposure in court. She tried one last manipulation tactic, reaching out through her sister to suggest we could work things out if I'd just take down the post and give her another chance. My response was delivered through my own lawyer. She had her chance to handle this privately. She chose to make it public. Now she gets to live with the public consequences of her public choices. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized with no drama, no negotiations, and no contact beyond what was legally required. She got exactly what she'd asked for in that office: a divorce. But she got it on my terms, not hers. The best part was watching how differently people treated me afterward. Instead of seeing someone who'd been blindsided by his wife's dissatisfaction, they saw someone who'd handled a malicious attack with strategic precision and unshakable composure. My professional reputation, which she'd tried to destroy, actually strengthened. Colleagues respected how I'd maintained focus during the office incident and how I'd handled the aftermath with facts rather than emotions. She'd wanted to paint me as weak and inadequate. Instead, she'd proven I was someone who wouldn't tolerate disrespect and wouldn't be destroyed by people who underestimated my intelligence. 6 months after her office performance, I ran into her at a mutual friend's event. She tried to avoid me, but our paths crossed near the exit. She looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. I didn't ignore her, but I didn't engage either. I simply nodded politely, the way you'd acknowledge any casual acquaintance, and continued my conversation with people who actually mattered. That moment said everything about how completely the situation had reversed. She tried to make me irrelevant in my own life. Instead, she'd made herself irrelevant in hers. The woman who'd planned my destruction had become a cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate someone's intelligence and overestimate your own cleverness. She'd wanted to humiliate me publicly. Instead, she'd humiliated herself permanently. And the best part was, I'd used her own playbook to do it.
Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.
Narrative.
I loosened my tie and grabbed a beer from the fridge, expecting the usual, "How was your day?" routine. Instead, she looked up at me with this serious expression and said she had something important to discuss. The way she said it, you'd think she was about to tell me she'd been diagnosed with something terminal. She turned the laptop screen toward me, and there it was. A detailed spreadsheet titled Annual Domestic Labor Compensation Analysis. I'm not kidding. She had calculated every single household task she performed and assigned it a monetary value. Cooking meals, cleaning bathrooms, doing laundry, grocery shopping, organizing closets. Everything had a price tag attached to it. The grand total at the bottom of the screen read $15,000. I sat down across from her, taking a long sip of my beer while she launched into her presentation. She had researched market rates for house cleaners, personal chefs, and domestic assistants. She'd calculated the hours she spent on each task and multiplied them by what she called industry standard wages. The whole thing was more thorough than most business proposals I'd seen at work. But here's what really caught my attention. She wasn't just showing me this as some interesting exercise. She was presenting it as a demand. She wanted me to acknowledge that she deserved $15,000 in compensation for her domestic contributions to our household. She suggested I should either pay her directly or find other ways to financially recognize her efforts. I kept my expression neutral while she talked, but my mind was already working. This wasn't just about money or recognition. This was about fundamentally changing the nature of our relationship from a partnership to a business transaction. And she was documenting every bit of it. The more she explained her reasoning, the more I realized she'd handed me something incredibly valuable. Not the way she intended, but valuable nonetheless. Every word she spoke, every calculation she'd made, every demand she was presenting, it was all being recorded in my memory with perfect clarity. She finished her presentation and leaned back in her chair, waiting for my response. I could see she expected me to be impressed by her thoroughness, maybe even apologetic for not recognizing her contributions before. Instead, I found myself genuinely curious about something else entirely. I asked her if she'd considered what would happen if someone applied this same business model to other aspects of our relationship. Her confident expression flickered for just a moment before she said that was different. But I could see I'd planted a seed of doubt. I told her I needed time to process what she'd shown me, that I wanted to review her calculations carefully and give her proposal the serious consideration it deserved. She seemed satisfied with that response, probably thinking she'd made a compelling case. As I headed upstairs that night, I was already thinking about my next move. She'd opened a door she probably wished she could close. But once you start treating a marriage like a business negotiation, you better be prepared for the other party to negotiate back. The funny thing about documentation is that it works both ways. She just created a detailed record of how she viewed our relationship. Now it was time for me to create my own records. Because if she wanted to play this game, I was going to make sure I won. I spent the rest of the evening thinking about every conversation we'd had over the past few months. Looking back, I could see this hadn't come out of nowhere. There had been subtle comments about fairness, hints about feeling unappreciated, suggestions that I didn't understand how much work she put into our home. But turning it into a formal business proposal? That was a level of calculation I hadn't expected. And the fact that she'd spent time researching market rates and creating professional documentation told me this wasn't some emotional outburst. This was planned, deliberate, and strategic. The irony wasn't lost on me. She thought she was being smart, building a case for why she deserved more recognition and compensation. What she'd actually done was create evidence of something much more significant. Evidence that would prove very useful in ways she never imagined. I went to bed that night with a clear head and a clearer purpose. Tomorrow, I'd start my own research. But unlike her focus on domestic labor rates, I'd be looking into something completely different. Something that would change both our lives in ways she never saw coming. The next morning, I woke up with a different perspective on everything. While she was in the shower, I took a closer look at her laptop, which she'd conveniently left open on the kitchen table. The spreadsheet was even more detailed than I'd initially realized. She had line items for things like preparing husband's coffee, valued at $12 per week. Organizing husband's closet was listed at $45 monthly. Even reminding husband of appointments had a price tag of $8 per occurrence. The audacity was almost impressive. But what really caught my attention were the inconsistencies. She listed grocery shopping as $120 monthly, but failed to mention that I paid for every single grocery bill. She'd assigned value to meal planning, but ignored the fact that half our dinners came from restaurants I paid for when she didn't feel like cooking. I started taking screenshots of everything. Not obviously, just quick captures while she was getting ready upstairs. Every calculation, every assumption, every inflated value she'd assigned to basic adult responsibilities. This wasn't just evidence of her mindset anymore. It was documentation of her attempt to rewrite the financial reality of our marriage. When she came downstairs for breakfast, I was already dressed and ready for work. I mentioned that I'd thought about her presentation overnight and wanted to discuss it more thoroughly when I got home. She seemed pleased, probably thinking I was coming around to her way of thinking. At work, instead of diving into my usual projects, I spent my lunch break doing research of my own. But I wasn't looking up domestic labor rates. I was researching something much more practical: divorce proceedings and how financial manipulation attempts are viewed by family courts. What I discovered was fascinating. Courts don't look favorably on spouses who try to retroactively monetize basic household contributions, especially when those contributions are part of a normal marriage partnership. More importantly, attempts to financially manipulate or extort a spouse can actually work against someone in divorce proceedings. I also learned that detailed documentation of such attempts can be incredibly valuable evidence. Every calculation she'd made, every demand she'd presented, every attempt to treat our marriage like a business transaction, it all painted a picture of someone who viewed the relationship in purely transactional terms. That evening, I came home with my own laptop and a much clearer understanding of what I was dealing with. She was waiting for me with the same expectant expression from the night before. She'd even printed out copies of her spreadsheet, as if we were going to negotiate a contract. I sat down across from her and opened my own laptop. I told her I'd been thinking about her proposal and had some questions about her methodology. Her eyes lit up. She thought I was engaging with her business model. I started with simple questions. How had she calculated the time spent on each task? Had she factored in the efficiency differences between professional services and personal completion? What about the quality standards she applied to her own work versus what a paid service would provide? With each question, I watched her confidence waver slightly. She hadn't thought through many of these details. Her calculations were based on inflated time estimates and premium service rates that didn't match the reality of what she actually did. Then I asked the question that really mattered. If she wanted to treat our household like a business, shouldn't all contributions be evaluated using the same standard? Her smile faltered as she realized where this was heading. I pulled up my own research on my laptop. Market rates for financial management, bill paying, home maintenance, yard work, and household repairs. The services I provided that she'd somehow forgotten to include in her analysis. Services that, when calculated using her own methodology, came to a significantly higher dollar amount than her $15,000. But that wasn't the real point. The real point was that she'd fundamentally misunderstood what she was doing. She thought she was building a case for recognition and compensation. What she'd actually done was create documented evidence of her attempt to financially manipulate our marriage. I closed my laptop and looked at her directly. I told her that her presentation had been very enlightening, but probably not in the way she'd intended. I could see the confusion in her eyes as she tried to process what I meant. I explained that treating a marriage like a business transaction was a fundamental change in the relationship dynamic. And if she truly believed that was the appropriate framework for our partnership, then perhaps we needed to evaluate whether we were compatible business partners. The room went quiet. She started to backtrack, saying she hadn't meant it that way, that she just wanted some appreciation for what she did. But the documentation was already created. The demands had already been made. The business model had already been proposed. I told her I needed more time to consider her proposal fully, that I wanted to do my own comprehensive analysis before making any decisions. She agreed, but I could see the uncertainty in her expression. She was beginning to realize that opening this door might not lead where she'd expected. That night, I began building my own detailed documentation. Not just financial calculations, but a timeline of events, screenshots of her demands, and records of every conversation we'd had about this topic. Because when someone hands you evidence of their true intentions, the smart move is to preserve it carefully. She wanted to play business. She was about to learn that in business, documentation is everything. Over the next 3 days, I conducted the most thorough financial analysis of my life. Not because I cared about proving who contributed more to our household, but because I needed bulletproof documentation for what was coming next. I started with the obvious stuff. Mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, utilities, car payments, groceries, dining out, vacations, her credit card bills, everything that came out of my income. The numbers were staggering when you actually added them up properly. But then I got creative with her own methodology. If she could assign hourly rates to domestic tasks, I could do the same for everything else. Home maintenance and repairs at contractor rates. Financial planning and bill management at professional service rates. Technology support and troubleshooting. Even driving her places when her car was in the shop. Using her exact same calculation method, my annual contribution came to over $68,000. More than 4 times her inflated estimate of $15,000. But the real gold mine was in the details of her own documentation. I spent hours going through every line item in her spreadsheet, and the picture that emerged was damning. She'd assigned premium rates to basic adult responsibilities while completely ignoring the financial reality of who actually paid for everything. She'd valued kitchen maintenance at $30 per cleaning session, but used premium house cleaning rates despite the fact that our kitchen was never professionally cleaned by any standard. She'd calculated laundry management based on commercial laundry rates, but ignored that I paid for the washer, dryer, detergent, and utilities that made that laundry possible. Most revealing was what she'd left out entirely. No credit for me paying the mortgage that put a roof over her head. No acknowledgement of the health insurance that came through my job. No recognition that every single bill, from electricity to internet to her car payment, came from my income. By Thursday evening, I had everything I needed. 2 different types of documentation that would serve 2 different purposes. The financial analysis that showed the absurdity of her position, and more importantly, the legal documentation that proved her intent to manipulate our marriage for financial gain. I'd also made some calls. Discreet inquiries to understand exactly how family courts view attempts at financial manipulation within marriages. The information I gathered was enlightening and would prove crucial for what came next. Friday night, she brought up her proposal again. She'd clearly been expecting me to come back with an acceptance of her terms, or at least a counteroffer that acknowledged her basic premise. Instead, I told her I'd completed my analysis and had some concerns about her methodology. I opened my laptop and showed her my calculations. Her face went through several expressions as she realized the scope of what I'd documented. When I got to the final number, $68,000 versus her $15,000, she tried to dismiss it as unfair comparison. That's when I explained the real problem with her approach. She'd fundamentally misunderstood the nature of marriage by trying to assign individual value to partnership contributions. But more than that, she'd created documentation that revealed her true view of our relationship as a transaction rather than a commitment. I told her that her spreadsheet wasn't just a request for recognition. It was evidence of a mindset that was incompatible with marriage itself. She'd literally priced out her love and partnership, turning our home into a workplace where she expected to be compensated like an employee. She started to get defensive, saying I was overreacting and missing her point. But I wasn't finished. I explained that once someone introduces financial manipulation into a marriage, it changes everything. Trust gets replaced by transaction. Partnership gets replaced by negotiation. Love gets replaced by leverage. I closed my laptop and looked at her directly. I told her that her presentation had clarified something important for me. It had shown me exactly how she viewed our relationship and what she thought she deserved from it. More importantly, it had shown me what I deserved from a marriage, and it wasn't this. The silence that followed was heavy. She tried to walk back her position, claiming she'd just wanted some appreciation and had gone about it the wrong way. But the documentation existed. The demands had been made. The business model had been formally presented. I told her I'd be making some decisions over the weekend about how to move forward. She could probably sense that something fundamental had shifted, but she didn't understand yet just how thoroughly she'd played herself. That weekend, I made appointments with two different professionals. The first was a forensic accountant who specialized in divorce proceedings. The second was a family law attorney who had an excellent reputation for protecting men's interests in contested divorces. Both meetings were eye-opening. The accountant confirmed that her documentation would be valuable evidence of financial manipulation attempts. The attorney was even more direct. She'd created a roadmap for how she planned to exploit the marriage financially, and courts don't look kindly on that kind of behavior. By Sunday evening, I had a clear strategy and timeline. She'd wanted to treat our marriage like a business transaction. She was about to discover that when you turn a relationship into a business, sometimes the other party decides to dissolve the partnership. The irony was perfect. Her $15,000 spreadsheet was going to cost her significantly more than that in the end. She documented her own greed and manipulation so thoroughly that any competent attorney could use it to demonstrate her true character and intentions. All I had to do now was execute the plan she'd unknowingly helped me create. Monday morning came with an unexpected development. She'd apparently spent the weekend preparing what she probably thought was a stronger negotiating position. When I came downstairs for coffee, she had additional printouts waiting for me on the kitchen table. She'd researched comparable households in our area and found examples of couples who had formal agreements about domestic responsibilities. She'd even found some blog posts from women who had successfully negotiated compensation from their husbands for household work. Her confidence was back, and she seemed to think she'd found the ammunition she needed. I sat down and reviewed her new materials while she explained how other couples had made these arrangements work. She'd highlighted several success stories where women had convinced their husbands to provide monthly allowances or direct payments for domestic contributions. She was essentially doubling down on her original position. When she finished her presentation, I set the papers aside and looked at her carefully. I told her I appreciated her additional research, but it had actually helped me reach a final decision about her proposal. Her expression brightened. She thought I was about to accept her terms. Instead, I explained that her continued efforts to build a case for financial compensation had made something crystal clear. She wasn't interested in improving our marriage or finding better ways to appreciate each other. She was interested in extracting money from our relationship through emotional manipulation and financial pressure. Her face changed as she realized this wasn't going the direction she'd expected. She started to interrupt, but I held up my hand and continued. I told her that over the past week, I'd done my own research, not just into domestic labor rates or household contributions, but into something much more relevant, how family courts view attempts at financial manipulation within marriages. Her confident expression started to crack. I explained that documenting demands for compensation, creating detailed spreadsheets to justify financial extraction, and presenting formal proposals to monetize basic marriage responsibilities isn't viewed favorably in legal proceedings. In fact, it's often seen as evidence of someone who views marriage as a transaction rather than a partnership. She tried to backtrack, saying I was mischaracterizing her intentions. But I pulled out my own documentation, screenshots of her original spreadsheet, copies of her additional research, and detailed notes from every conversation we'd had about this topic. I told her that what she'd created wasn't just a request for appreciation. It was a documented pattern of attempting to financially manipulate our marriage. Every calculation, every demand, every follow-up presentation, it all painted a picture of someone who had fundamentally misunderstood what marriage means. The room went completely silent. She was starting to understand that her business approach to our relationship had consequences she hadn't considered. But I wasn't finished. I explained that once someone introduces this level of financial calculation into a marriage, it's impossible to go back. Trust gets replaced by spreadsheets. Love gets replaced by hourly rates. Partnership gets replaced by employment negotiations. She'd fundamentally changed the nature of our relationship, and there was no undoing that. She finally spoke up, saying I was overreacting and that she just wanted some recognition for her contributions. But I'd anticipated this response. I asked her why. If recognition was all she wanted, she'd spent time researching market rates and calculating precise dollar amounts. Why she'd presented formal proposals instead of simply talking about feeling unappreciated. Her answer confirmed everything I needed to know. She said that talking hadn't worked, so she needed to present her case in terms I would understand, business terms. She needed to show me the real value of what she provided. There it was. She'd just admitted that her approach was deliberate and calculated. She'd consciously chosen to treat our marriage like a business negotiation because she thought it would be more effective than honest communication. I told her that her strategy had indeed been effective, just not in the way she'd intended. It had shown me exactly who I was married to and what she thought our relationship was worth. More importantly, it had given me the clarity I needed to make some important decisions. I stood up from the table and told her that her $15,000 spreadsheet was going to be very useful in the coming weeks, but not for getting her the compensation she wanted. Instead, it would serve as evidence in proceedings she apparently hadn't considered when she created it. The look of confusion and growing panic on her face told me she was beginning to understand the situation. But understanding and accepting are two different things. She demanded to know what I meant by proceedings and evidence. I told her she'd find out soon enough, that her business approach to our marriage was about to be evaluated by professionals who specialize in exactly these kinds of situations. People who understand the difference between genuine partnership and financial manipulation. As I headed upstairs to get ready for work, she was still sitting at the table, staring at the spreadsheets and research materials she'd thought would strengthen her position. What she didn't realize was that every piece of paper in front of her was evidence against her. Her calculated approach to our marriage was about to meet an even more calculated response. The difference was that my calculations included variables she'd never considered, like divorce attorneys, forensic accountants, and family court judges who've seen this kind of manipulation before. She'd wanted to play business. Now she was going to learn what happens when the other party decides to terminate the partnership. Tuesday morning, I served her with divorce papers at breakfast. She was sitting at the same kitchen table where she'd presented her $15,000 spreadsheet just over a week ago. The irony wasn't lost on me as I handed her the legal documents that would end our marriage. Her reaction went through several stages. First shock, then anger, then desperation as she realized I was completely serious. She tried everything from tears to threats to promises that she'd never bring up the money issue again. But it was too late for that. Once someone shows you who they really are, you can't unsee it. Her spreadsheet had revealed a fundamental truth about how she viewed our relationship, and no amount of backtracking could change that. What really seemed to hit her was when she started reading through the divorce filing. Her own documentation was referenced multiple times throughout the legal paperwork. Every calculation she'd made, every demand she'd presented, every follow-up proposal. It was all there as evidence of financial manipulation within the marriage. My attorney had been thorough. The filing detailed her attempts to retroactively monetize basic household responsibilities, her creation of formal proposals demanding compensation, and her continued efforts to pressure me into accepting her business model for our marriage. She looked up from the papers with genuine panic in her eyes. She asked how her request for appreciation had turned into evidence against her in divorce proceedings. I told her that's what happens when you try to turn love into a business transaction. The next few weeks were enlightening. Her attorney tried to argue that her spreadsheet was just an expression of feeling undervalued, not a serious financial demand. But the documentation was too thorough and too calculated to dismiss as emotional outburst. During depositions, she had to explain why she'd researched market rates for domestic services, why she'd calculated precise hourly wages for basic adult responsibilities, why she'd presented formal proposals with specific dollar amounts. Every answer made her position worse. The forensic accountant I'd hired presented his own analysis to the court. Using her exact methodology, he showed that my financial contributions to the marriage were over 4 times larger than her inflated domestic labor calculations. More importantly, he demonstrated that her approach ignored the fundamental financial structure that made our household possible. But the real damage came from the pattern of behavior her documentation revealed. The court saw someone who viewed marriage as a transaction where she deserved compensation for basic partnership responsibilities. Someone who had tried to leverage domestic contributions into financial gain. My attorney argued that her actions showed a fundamental misunderstanding of marriage itself, that she'd attempted to create an employer-employee relationship where none should exist. That her demands represented a form of financial manipulation incompatible with genuine partnership. When the judge delivered his ruling, the irony was complete. Not only did I get the divorce I wanted, but her own evidence had ensured that the financial settlement was far more favorable to me than it would have been otherwise. Her $15,000 spreadsheet had cost her significantly more than $15,000. It had cost her the marriage, her credibility in court, and a substantial portion of what she might have received in a normal divorce proceeding. As I signed the final papers, I reflected on how perfectly this had worked out. She'd thought she was being clever by documenting her demands and building a business case for compensation. Instead, she'd created the evidence that proved she was never really committed to the marriage in the first place. Her calculation had been wrong from the beginning. She'd tried to price out love and partnership, but had ended up pricing herself out of both. 6 months later, I was sitting in my own kitchen, coffee in hand, reading the final divorce decree. The house was quiet in a way that felt peaceful rather than empty. No more spreadsheets on the table. No more calculated demands for compensation. Just the calm that comes from making the right decision. The legal proceedings had concluded exactly as my attorney predicted. Her own documentation had been the cornerstone of my case, proving beyond doubt that she'd attempted to financially manipulate our marriage. The judge had been particularly unimpressed with her efforts to monetize basic adult responsibilities. In the end, she received far less than she would have in a standard divorce settlement. Her attempts to extract $15,000 in domestic labor compensation had cost her tens of thousands in lost alimony and asset division. The court had viewed her behavior as evidence of bad faith, which influenced every aspect of the financial ruling. The most satisfying moment had come during the final hearing when her attorney tried one last desperate argument. He claimed that her spreadsheet showed she was simply advocating for recognition of women's unpaid labor. The judge had shut that down immediately, pointing out that marriage is a partnership, not an employment arrangement. My attorney had delivered the final blow by showing that her calculations ignored the fundamental financial reality of our household. Every bill, every mortgage payment, every expense that made our domestic life possible had come from my income. She tried to claim compensation for maintaining a lifestyle she hadn't financially contributed to creating. But beyond the legal victory, something more important had happened. I'd learned to recognize manipulation for what it is and respond accordingly. Too many men would have tried to negotiate with her demands or found some compromise that validated her approach. That would have been a mistake. When someone shows you they view your relationship as a transaction, believe them. When they try to leverage love into financial gain, don't negotiate, terminate. Marriage isn't a business, and anyone who thinks it should be isn't ready for the real thing. The irony remained perfect. She'd spend hours creating documentation to prove she deserved $15,000 for her domestic contributions. Instead, she'd created evidence that she didn't deserve to remain in the marriage at all. Her spreadsheet had become the smoking gun that proved her true character. Every calculation had revealed someone who saw partnership as profit opportunity. Every demand had shown someone who confused love with leverage. 6 months later, she was living in a small apartment, working full-time to support herself, and probably wishing she'd never heard of domestic labor calculations. Meanwhile, I was in the house I'd paid for, living the peaceful life I'd earned with the respect I demanded. The kitchen table where she'd presented her business proposal now held my morning newspaper and coffee. No spreadsheets in sight. No calculations of who owed whom what for basic human decency. Just the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew his worth and refused to let anyone price it incorrectly. Her $15,000 mistake had taught me something invaluable. When someone tries to turn your marriage into their business opportunity, the smartest response is to close the business permanently. Some partnerships aren't worth saving, especially when one partner views the other as a customer rather than an equal. The math had worked out perfectly. She'd calculated her way right out of a marriage, a home, and a future she'd taken for granted. Meanwhile, I'd calculated my way into freedom, peace, and the knowledge that I'd never settle for transactional love again. Her labor had indeed become unpaid. Because when you try to bill your husband for being your wife, you end up working for yourself.